The Galactic Confederacy had, over the course of 17,000 standard cycles, developed what they considered an irrefutable truth about combat. If you weren't using weapons, you weren't really fighting. You were just flailing around like a hatchling who hadn't discovered tools yet. This wasn't opinion. This was science, backed by countless studies, military doctrine papers, and the collective experience of 47 species who had all independently arrived at the same conclusion. Combat required equipment, armor plating, energy shields, plasma projectors, kinetic accelerators, or at the very least, a sharpened stick. The notion that a sentient being would voluntarily enter combat without technological or manufactured advantage was viewed with the same bewilderment that one might reserve for someone who insisted on performing surgery with their teeth. The Vorthani, who possessed natural carapace armor thick enough to deflect small arms fire, still wore additional plating into battle. The Screeth, whose limbs could regenerate within hours, still carried energy weapons. Even the Murelians, who could literally project corrosive acid from specialized glands, still deployed behind portable shield generators. It wasn't cowardice, it was common sense. Then humanity showed up and ruined everything. The initial contact had gone smoothly enough. Humans seemed reasonable, cooperative, appropriately impressed by the majesty of interstellar civilization. They signed the standard treaties, established trade agreements, and began the lengthy process of cultural integration. Everything was proceeding according to the established first contact protocols that had worked flawlessly for millennia. Then someone made the mistake of asking humans about their military traditions. What followed was a presentation that left the entire diplomatic corps of the Confederacy questioning whether the translator matrices were malfunctioning. Humans explained, with disturbing enthusiasm, about something called martial arts. Not the use of weapons in artistic formation, which would have made sense. No, this was the art of fighting without weapons, on purpose, as a deliberate choice. The confused silence that followed this revelation stretched for nearly a full minute. "Let me clarify," Ambassador Threll of the Corventine Empire had said, his translator barely keeping pace with his bewilderment. "You developed systematic methods of combat that specifically exclude the use of weapons." "That's correct," the human diplomat had replied, seeming pleased that the concept was understood. But why? This question came from at least 12 different delegates simultaneously. The human had smiled in that peculiar way humans did when they were about to say something they found obvious but expected others to find confusing. Because sometimes you don't have a weapon, or because the situation doesn't call for lethal force, or for sport, physical conditioning, mental discipline, cultural preservation, or because it's fun. Fun. They fought without weapons for fun. The Confederacy's military analysts spent the next 6 months trying to understand this bizarre human quirk. They watched recordings of human martial arts competitions with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for studying primitive pre-spaceflight civilizations. Humans grappling, striking, throwing each other, all without a single piece of actual combat equipment. Just flesh against flesh, technique against technique. It was adorable, really, like watching kittens play fighting. The analysts concluded that this was likely some kind of ritualized recreational activity that humans nostalgically maintained despite its complete lack of practical application. After all, what possible use could unarmed combat have in an age of plasma rifles and shield technology? The Krallick's Dominion, however, saw it differently. The Krallicks were apex predators from a death world that made Earth look like a vacation resort. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, possessed retractable claws that could shred duralloy, had armored scales covering their entire bodies, and could bench press a small shuttle. They were also, to put it diplomatically, insufferably arrogant about their natural combat advantages. When War Master Drakor, current champion of the Krallick's Proving Grounds, heard about humanity's quaint belief in unarmed combat, he didn't find it adorable. He found it insulting. These soft skins think they can fight without weapons? Drakor had roared during a diplomatic reception, his voice carrying across the entire hall. They think their fragile flesh and weak bones can stand against true biological superiority? The human delegation at the event had politely tried to de-escalate. This was, after all, a cocktail party at a neutral station, not the appropriate venue for interspecies chest-thumping. But Drakor was already warmed up, fortified by 3 glasses of Corellian fire wine and the enthusiastic agreement of his entourage. "I issue a formal challenge," Drakor announced, his translator rendering his declaration in 17 languages simultaneously. "Any human who believes their primitive flailing can match Krallick's combat prowess may face me in the arena. No weapons, no armor, no technology, just flesh and bone, as they claim to prefer. I will provide a demonstration of why evolution designed predators with natural weapons and prey species without them." The silence that followed was profound and awkward. Diplomatic incidents had been started over less. Several ambassadors began frantically composing messages to their respective governments, anticipating the political fallout. The human delegation exchanged glances, clearly trying to decide between diplomatic courtesy and the very human urge to accept a challenge that came with such spectacular trash talk. Then someone in the back of the human section laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a polite chuckle. It was genuine amusement, the kind of laughter that suggested the person had just heard a joke they couldn't wait to tell their friends. All eyes turned to identify the source. Captain Rena Vasquez of the Human Colonial Security Force was not laughing at Drakor because she found him non-threatening. She was laughing because she had just watched a 3-meter-tall apex predator with natural weapons and armor challenge humans to unarmed combat, apparently unaware that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history figuring out how to kill things bigger and more naturally dangerous than themselves without proper equipment. Vasquez was 34 standard years old, had been practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu since she was 7, held black belts in 3 different martial arts, and had spent the last decade as a close protection specialist for high-risk diplomatic missions. She was also, at the moment, technically off-duty, and 3 drinks into what was supposed to be a relaxing evening. "I'll take that challenge," she said, still grinning. The human ambassador's head whipped around so fast, his glasses nearly flew off. "Captain Vasquez, that's not necessary. I'm sure War Master Drakor didn't mean—" "Oh, I meant every word," Drakor interrupted, his predatory gaze fixed on Vasquez. He looked her up and down, with visible disdain. She was barely 1.7 meters tall, probably weighed less than one of his arms, and appeared to be unarmed and unarmored. Perfect. "You accept? Truly?" "Sure," Vasquez said, setting down her drink. "When and where?" Within hours, what should have been a minor diplomatic awkwardness had evolved into the most anticipated sporting event in recent Confederacy history. The neutral station's main arena was hastily prepared. Betting pools sprang up across human ships, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for major sporting championships. The odds were not in Vasquez's favor among non-humans, who saw this as a tragic but educational demonstration of biological reality. Among humans, however, the betting was fierce and heavily weighted toward their representative. The arena itself was a circular platform 50 meters in diameter, equipped with medical stations, shield generators in case things got truly out of hand, and seating for several thousand spectators. By the time of the scheduled match, every seat was filled, with thousands more watching via live feed across the Confederacy. Drakor entered first, and the arena's environmental systems struggled to handle the sound of Kralik supporters roaring their approval. He wore simple combat shorts that did nothing to hide his impressive musculature and natural weaponry. His scales glinted under the arena lights, his claws extended and retracted in anticipation, and his tail swept behind him with clear eagerness. He looked like evolution's answer to the question, what if we made something that could kill you in 15 different ways? The crowd's enthusiasm reached fever pitch. This was going to be spectacular. Tragic, certainly, but spectacular. Then Vasquez walked out, and the human section erupted while everyone else fell into confused silence. She wore a simple athletic outfit, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her expression calm and focused. She didn't flex, didn't posture, didn't attempt any intimidation displays. She walked to her side of the arena, performed a few casual stretches, rolled her shoulders, and looked across at Drakor with the expression of someone about to start their morning workout routine. The contrast was absurd. Drakor looked like a war machine. Vasquez looked like she was waiting for a yoga class to start. Is she insane? Someone whispered in the Vorthani section. Humans have strange concepts of honor, another replied. Perhaps dying in combat against impossible odds has cultural significance. The human section, meanwhile, was having a very different conversation. 20 credits says she gets the takedown in under 10 seconds. You're on. I say under 5. Does anyone else think Drakor looks like he's never grappled before? Oh, he definitely hasn't. Look at that stance. He's planning to swing those claws and thinks that's going to be the whole fight. The referee, a neutral Corellian official who looked deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation, stepped into the center of the arena. The rules were explained, though they were simple enough. No weapons, no lethal techniques. Fight continues until submission or incapacitation. Medical teams were standing by. May the best sentient win. Drakor and Vasquez approached the center. The size difference was even more pronounced up close. Drakor could probably have picked her up with one hand. Last chance to withdraw, human? Drakor said, his voice a low rumble. I have no wish to seriously injure you. This demonstration need not come at the cost of your permanent health. Vasquez looked up at him, her expression unchanged. That's very considerate. Same offer to you. Somewhere in the Kralik section, someone laughed, thinking it was a joke. Drakor's eyes narrowed. You have spirit. I respect that. It will not save you. Probably not. Vasquez agreed pleasantly. Shall we begin? The referee raised his hand, looked between the two combatants one last time as if hoping someone would come to their senses, then dropped his hand and quickly retreated to a safe distance. Begin. Drakor moved exactly as every human in the audience expected. He reared back, claws extended, preparing to deliver a devastating overhead strike that would likely have shredded armor plating. It was an impressive display of power, strength, and natural weaponry. It was also telegraphed so clearly that Vasquez could have taken a coffee break and still had time to respond. What happened next occurred in approximately 1.3 seconds, though every being watching would later swear it happened simultaneously. Vasquez moved forward instead of back, closing the distance before Drakor's strike could build momentum. Her right hand shot up, catching his descending wrist just below the joint. Her left hand went high, gripping just above his elbow. Her body turned, her hip positioned perfectly against his center of mass. And then she did something that made every being watching experience a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. She used leverage. Dracor's wrist, strong enough to crush duralloy, suddenly found itself bent at an angle that biomechanics and joint structure absolutely did not support. The armored scales that protected him from energy weapons offered no defense against his own bones, moving in directions they were never designed to move. The massive muscles that let him bench press shuttles were suddenly working against him as Vasquez used his own strength and momentum as weapons. The sound of Dracor's wrist breaking was surprisingly loud in the suddenly silent arena. It wasn't a clean snap. It was more of a complicated crunch as multiple bones decided they no longer wanted to be in their current configuration. Dracor's triumphant war cry transformed into a roar of shock and pain. His claws, still extended for the strike that never landed, flexed spasmodically. Vasquez maintained control of the joint for another half-second, ensuring the damage was sufficient to end the threat, then released and stepped back smoothly. The entire sequence, from the beginning of Dracor's strike to Vasquez stepping away, had taken less time than it took most beings to process what they were seeing. Dracor stood there, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his expression cycling through confusion, pain, and the dawning realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his understanding of reality. He looked at his broken wrist, then at Vasquez, then back at his wrist, as if hoping the scene would make more sense the second time around. "What?" he said slowly, his translator struggling with the mixture of pain and bewilderment in his voice. "Just happened?" Vasquez maintained her ready stance, though she kept her distance respectfully. "You telegraphed your strike. I intercepted the joint before you could build momentum, used your forward motion against you, and applied pressure perpendicular to your wrist's structural tolerance. Basic joint manipulation." The silence in the arena was absolute. Somewhere, a translator hiccuped, unable to process the cognitive dissonance of what it had just witnessed. "But," Dracor said, still staring at his wrist, "my bones are 3 times denser than yours. My natural armor—" "Doesn't protect joints," Vasquez interrupted gently. "Armor never does. That's why joints exist. They have to move, which means they have structural weak points. Doesn't matter how dense your bones are if they're being levered against themselves." In the Kralik section, Dracor's supporters sat in stunned silence. In the human section, credits were changing hands rapidly while people argued about exact timing. "Fight continues until submission or incapacitation," the referee announced uncertainly. "Does the War Master wish to submit?" Dracor's pride wrestled with his tactical assessment. He still had one functional arm, his legs, his tail, his claws. But that functional arm was now his left, his non-dominant side, and the human was looking at him with an expression of professional assessment that suggested she had already calculated 17 different ways to break it too. "I can continue," Dracor growled, shifting his stance to protect his injured arm. "You really don't want to," Vasquez said, not unkindly. "You broke one limb. I have 3 others." "True. Want to see what happens to them?" It wasn't a boast. It was a genuine question, delivered in the same tone someone might use to ask if you wanted fries with your order. Dracor lunged forward, leading with his left arm this time, trying to grab and use his superior strength and weight advantage. It was a reasonable tactical adaptation. It also didn't work. Vasquez dropped her level, evading the grab entirely, and her hands shot out to catch his ankle mid-step. A twist, a pull, and suddenly Dracor's impressive mass was working against him as gravity remembered it existed. He went down hard, his injured arm instinctively trying to catch his fall, which resulted in another roar of pain as broken bones protested their treatment. Before he could recover, Vasquez had moved to his back, one arm snaking around his thick neck in what observers would later learn was called a rear naked choke. Her legs wrapped around his torso, hooks in, position secure. Drakor's free hand came up to pull at her arm and found that no matter how strong his grip, he couldn't break the hold. She wasn't trying to overpower his strength. She was compressing his carotid arteries, cutting blood flow to his brain. Strength was irrelevant. Tap or sleep, Vasquez said calmly, her voice slightly strained from the exertion. Your choice. Drakor tried to stand, to throw her off, to use his weight. His vision began to tunnel. The roaring in his ears wasn't the crowd anymore. It was his own body screaming about oxygen deprivation. His claws scratched uselessly at her arm, finding no purchase. 3 seconds later, his hand tapped frantically against her forearm. Vasquez released immediately, rolling clear as Drakor gasped and coughed, his functioning hand going to his throat. She stood, breathing slightly elevated, but otherwise looking like she'd just finished a light sparring session, and waited to see if medical intervention was needed. The arena remained silent. Somewhere, a translator kept repeating the phrase, joint manipulation, as if repetition would make it make sense. The referee, after confirming that Drakor was conscious and breathing, raised his hand. Submission acknowledged. Victory to Captain Reina Vasquez of Earth. The human section absolutely lost their minds. The medical team swarmed Drakor, scanners already working to assess the damage. The Kralix War Master, pride of his species and undefeated champion of the proving grounds, sat on the arena floor, looking like someone had just explained to him that gravity was actually optional, and he'd been doing it wrong his whole life. I don't understand, he said to the nearest medic, who happened to be human. I am stronger, faster. My natural weapons don't matter if you don't know how to use them, the medic said, already preparing a bone regeneration scaffold. You're a striker who's never grappled, fighting a grappler who's spent decades learning how to neutralize size and strength advantages. You brought claws to a leverage fight. But the principles of combat changed about 30,000 years ago on Earth when someone figured out that technique beats attributes every time. Welcome to the learning curve. This is going to sting. Across the arena, Vasquez was surrounded by reporters, diplomats, and military observers, all shouting questions simultaneously. She fielded them with the same calm competence she'd shown in the fight. Captain Vasquez, how did you defeat an opponent with such clear physical advantages? I didn't defeat his advantages. I made them irrelevant. You don't arm wrestle an opponent who's stronger than you. You use technique to bypass strength entirely. Is this typical of human combat training? It's one approach. We have dozens of martial arts traditions, each with different philosophies and methods. What you saw was basic grappling. There are strikers who could have handled this differently. The point is, we've spent millennia developing systematic methods to let smaller, weaker individuals defeat larger, stronger opponents. It's kind of our specialty. But why? This from a Vorthani military analyst. Why develop such methods when weapons and armor are available? Vasquez smiled. Because sometimes you don't have weapons. Sometimes the situation requires non-lethal resolution. Sometimes you need to subdue without killing. And honestly, because it's useful. Human history is full of situations where technique and training defeated raw power. We just formalized it. The questions continued, but the real conversations were happening elsewhere. In military headquarters across the Confederacy, analysts were frantically reviewing footage of the fight, their understanding of combat fundamentals experiencing rapid renovation. Terms like leverage, joint manipulation, center of gravity, and blood choke were being added to tactical databases with urgent priority flags. The Galactic Dominion's military council was in emergency session, reviewing every piece of human martial arts footage they could acquire. The uncomfortable realization was settling in that they had been sending warriors into combat with a fundamental gap in their training. They knew how to use their natural weapons. They had never considered what happened when those weapons were neutralized by an opponent who understood biomechanics better than they did. The Vorthani Empire's ambassador was composing a formal request to establish a cultural exchange program focused on human martial arts. The Screeth Collective was already discussing establishing a training facility. The Morellians were calculating whether their acid projection provided defense against joint locks and concluding uncomfortably that it probably didn't. Back in the medical bay, Drakor sat with his wrist immobilized in a regeneration field, watching replays of the fight on a medical monitor. Each viewing made the defeat somehow worse and more educational simultaneously. "I telegraphed the strike," he muttered to himself. "You sure did," Vasquez said from the doorway. He hadn't heard her enter. That was also concerning. "I thought power would be sufficient," Drakor continued. "I thought my natural advantages meant technique was secondary. That's a common mistake. Biology gives you tools. Training teaches you when and how to use them. You've got incredible natural weapons. You just never learn to actually fight with them." Drakor looked at her, his pride warring with genuine curiosity. "And you could teach this? To species with natural weapons and armor?" "Absolutely. That's the thing about martial arts. The principles adapt. We've got techniques for people with long reach, short reach, heavyweight, lightweight. Joint locks work on anything with joints. Leverage works on anything with mass. The specifics change, but the fundamentals are universal." "The Galactic Dominion does not enjoy defeat," Drakor said slowly. "But we respect strength and skill. You demonstrated both. I would request instruction, if you would grant it." Vasquez grinned. "You know what? I've got 3 weeks before my next assignment. Let's see what you can learn." 3 months later, the Confederacy Military Academy on the neutral world of Unarmed opened its new facility, the Interspecies Combat Training Center. The name was bureaucratic and boring. Everyone just called it the dojo. Vasquez stood at the front of a class containing 20 different species, ranging from the Kraliks to beings who massed less than 40 kilograms. Drakor, his wrist fully healed, served as her assistant instructor, demonstrating techniques from the perspective of someone who had learned them the hard way. "Today, we're covering basic joint locks," Vasquez announced. "Pair up, size and strength differences don't matter. In fact, the bigger difference, the better. You need to learn that technique makes strength optional, not eliminated." A young Vorthani recruit raised his armored appendage. "Instructor, how do we apply techniques when our biology is so different?" "Great question. Watch this." She gestured to Drakor, who stepped forward. "War Master Drakor's wrist anatomy is different from mine. Different bone structure, different joint mechanics, different range of motion. But the principle stays the same. Find the angle where the joint's structural integrity is weakest. Apply force perpendicular to that angle. Use their own momentum against them. Drakor, grab my wrist like you're going to throw me." What followed was a careful demonstration of how the same fundamental principle adapted to different anatomies. The Vorthani recruit, despite his natural armor, discovered that his joints still had mechanical limits. The Screeth student, despite regeneration, learned that broken bones hurt before they healed. Everyone learned that evolution's gifts were tools, not guarantees. In the observation gallery, military officials from 24 species watched with intense interest. Humans, it turned out, had been sitting on a mountain of tactical knowledge that nobody else had bothered to develop because they assumed weapons made it unnecessary. "This changes combat doctrine," a Corvantine general muttered. "Infiltration teams, boarding actions, close protection details, any scenario where weapons are impractical or unavailable. If our personnel have this training, when our personnel have this training," his human counterpart corrected. "You're already 2 months behind our implementation schedule." Down on the training floor, a Kralik student successfully executed a joint lock on a Morellian partner 3 times his size. The Morellian tapped out. Then both broke into excited discussion about angles and leverage points. Vasquez watched with satisfaction. This was her favorite part. The moment when students realized that physics and biomechanics didn't care about species or evolution. The principles worked because they were based on fundamental forces that governed all physical interaction in the universe. "Instructor?" a human student approached. "Some of us are concerned about teaching potential adversaries our techniques." "Legitimate concern," Vasquez acknowledged. "But here's the thing. We're not giving away secrets. We're sharing knowledge that humans developed because we've spent our entire history fighting things bigger, stronger, and more naturally armed than us." "These species?" "They've spent their history assuming their natural advantages were sufficient. We're not arming them. We're filling gaps in their education that we've already adapted to. Plus, humans are still the only species that spent 10,000 years actively developing this stuff. By the time they catch up to our current level, we'll be another 10,000 years ahead. We're not giving away our advantage. We're just making the playing field more interesting." The student considered this, then nodded and returned to practice. 6 months after the match, Vasquez found herself in an unexpected role. Consultant to the Confederacy Defense Council on unarmed combat integration. It was tedious, involved far too many committee meetings, and paid significantly better than her previous position. "The fundamental principle," she explained to yet another assembly of military officials, "is that weapons extend your capability, but they shouldn't define it. A warrior who can only fight with equipment is vulnerable whenever that equipment is unavailable, damaged, or inappropriate for the situation. A warrior who understands fundamentals can adapt to any scenario. Human military doctrine has always emphasized this. We train with weapons, yes, but we also train to fight without them, because history has repeatedly demonstrated that you don't get to choose your combat parameters." "How many humans have this training?" someone asked. "Depends on your definition of training. Basic hand-to-hand combat is standard in most human military organizations. Serious martial arts training? Millions of practitioners across hundreds of different systems. We have competitive leagues, traditional schools, modern mixed-approach academies, military special operations units, civilian self-defense programs, cultural preservation societies, you name it. It's deeply embedded in our culture." "And you're willing to share all of this?" Vasquez smiled. "We're willing to share the fundamentals, sure. But understand, humans have been developing, refining, and innovating martial arts for thousands of years. We have ancient traditional systems, modern competitive formats, military close-quarters battle programs, and experimental hybrid approaches. By all means, learn what we teach. Just remember that we've got a significant head start, and we're not standing still." Back on Earth, in a traditional dojo in Tokyo, Master Tanaka watched news footage of alien species practicing kata and chuckled. He was 93 standard years old, had been practicing martial arts for 85 of those years, and was deeply amused by the Confederacy's excitement over discovering what humans had been doing since before recorded history. "They act like we invented something new," he said to his senior student. "We just never stopped doing what all species had to do before weapons: figure out how to fight with what we have. They forgot, we remembered." "Should we be concerned about teaching potential enemies?" the student asked. Tanaka laughed, the sound like dry leaves rustling. "My boy, we're teaching them the basics. By the time they master what we're sharing, we'll have evolved 5 more generations ahead. This is not giving away secrets. This is introducing them to a conversation we've been having with ourselves for 10,000 years. Let them join. It'll be interesting." In the Confederacy Military Academy, Drakor stood before his own class now, teaching joint manipulation to a room full of Krallick's warriors who had initially been skeptical that their champion had anything to learn from softskins. "The human broke my wrist before I completed my strike," Drakor explained, not for the first time. "Not because she was stronger, not because she was faster, because she understood the biomechanics of the attack better than I did. I was using power. She was using physics. Physics doesn't care about your muscles. Observe." He demonstrated, moving through the same sequence that had ended his undefeated record, but this time from both perspectives. His students watched with the intense focus of warriors who had just learned there was an entire dimension of combat they'd been ignorant of. The human instructor says that on Earth, smaller individuals regularly defeat larger ones through technique alone. One student ventured. "This seems improbable." "I thought so too," Drakor said, displaying his wrist where the bone had been broken. "I was incorrect. I learned this through direct experience, which I do not recommend. Learned from my mistake instead. Size and strength are advantages. They are not guarantees. Technique makes advantages optional." Back on the neutral station where the original match had occurred, the arena had been converted into a permanent training facility. The attendance numbers were staggering. Species from across the Confederacy were sending representatives to learn these strange human fighting methods that turned physical disadvantages into irrelevances. Vasquez returned occasionally to teach seminars. She found it endlessly entertaining that the Confederacy had spent 17,000 cycles developing advanced weapons technology while somehow never developing systematic unarmed combat. They had energy shields that could stop plasma bolts but hadn't figured out joint locks. They had armor that could withstand explosions but remained vulnerable to a properly applied choke. "It's like they skipped a chapter," she explained to a journalist doing a feature piece on the phenomenon. "They went straight from claws and teeth to plasma rifles, and never bothered with the middle part where you figure out how bodies actually work." Meanwhile, humans spent our entire history fighting things that wanted to eat us, usually without proper equipment. So we got really good at understanding leverage, joint mechanics, blood flow, nervous system function, all the things that make bodies work and how to make them stop working when necessary. Some critics argue that humans are violent and primitive for maintaining these traditions, the journalist noted. Vasquez laughed. "Some critics got their understanding of humans from bad data. We're not violent, we're prepared. There's a difference. Every human martial artist I know is among the calmest, most peaceful people you'll meet. They're calm because they're confident. They're confident because they know that if everything goes wrong, if all the weapons fail, if all the technology breaks, if all the advantages disappear, they still have options. That's not violence. That's competence. And the Confederacy is now spending billions to acquire this competence. The Confederacy is playing catch-up on knowledge that humans developed because we didn't have a choice. We couldn't afford to assume our natural weapons were sufficient. Because we didn't have impressive natural weapons. We couldn't assume our armor would protect us, because we didn't have natural armor. We had to actually learn how combat works at a fundamental level. Turns out, that knowledge is pretty valuable. The interview aired across Confederacy networks and sparked yet another wave of interest in human martial arts. Applications to the training center tripled. Publishing companies scrambled to translate human martial arts texts into 17 different languages. Several species began incorporating unarmed combat into their standard military training. 1 year after the match, Vasquez attended a ceremony where the Confederacy Defense Council formally incorporated human-developed combat principles into military doctrine. It was a bureaucratic event full of speeches and ceremonial gestures, but the implications were profound. The Confederacy had officially acknowledged that humans, despite being relative newcomers and lacking impressive natural weapons, had developed combat knowledge that their civilization had overlooked for millennia. Drakor attended as well, now fully credentialed as an instructor in multiple martial arts systems. He had taken to the training with the zealous intensity of someone who had discovered a gap in their education and was determined to fill it. "I believed I was a warrior," he told Vasquez during the reception. "I was merely someone with natural weapons who had never learned how to truly fight. You showed me the difference. For this, I am grateful." "You had the humility to learn from defeat," Vasquez replied. "That's rarer and more valuable than natural advantages. Most warriors would have made excuses. You took notes." "My pride considered making excuses," Drakor admitted. "But my tactical assessment concluded that excuses would not prevent the same defeat from recurring. Better to learn. My question now: how much more is there to learn?" Vasquez grinned. "Drakor, you've learned maybe 1% of what humans have developed. There are martial arts systems you haven't heard of, principles you haven't encountered, techniques that haven't been shared outside Earth. You could train for the rest of your life and still find human martial artists who know things you don't. This is simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Welcome to how humans feel about the rest of the universe's technology. You've got ships that can cross galaxies. We've got fighting systems that span millennia. Everyone has something to teach." 2 years after the match, the phenomenon had expanded beyond military applications. Civilian martial arts schools were opening across the Confederacy. Humans found themselves in unexpected demand as instructors, consultants, and advisors. The cultural exchange worked both ways. Humans learned about alien biomechanics and discovered new applications for ancient principles. A Screeth martial artist developed a hybrid style that incorporated their regenerative capabilities with human grappling techniques, creating a system that emphasized submissions and joint attacks that would be debilitating to species without rapid healing. A Vorthani practitioner adapted striking techniques to work with their armored physiology, discovering that while their natural armor protected against many attacks, it also limited their mobility in ways that could be exploited by someone who understood weight distribution. The innovations flowed in all directions. Humans learned. Aliens learned. Everyone got better at not dying when things went wrong. Master Tanaka, watching all of this from his dojo on Earth, continued to chuckle. He had received formal invitations to teach at the Confederacy Academy, offers of significant payment, requests for interviews, and proposals for documentary series. He had declined them all. "I teach here," he explained to his students. "I have always taught here. This dojo has educated warriors for 300 years across 9 generations. Let the galaxy come to us if they wish to learn. We have time. We're not going anywhere." And they did come. The dojo received applications from 17 species, most of whom had never set foot on Earth. Master Tanaka accepted 3 per year, carefully selected, and put them through the same rigorous training that had been teaching humans for centuries. The principles do not change, he insisted. Your biology changes, your natural weapons change. The physics of leverage, the biomechanics of joint manipulation, the geometry of angles and force. These are constants. Learn the constants, adapt them to your variables. This is the way. 5 years after the match, a new generation of Confederacy warriors graduated from military academies with comprehensive unarmed combat training integrated into their standard curriculum. They were more capable, more adaptable, more confident than previous generations. They still carried weapons and wore armor. But now they understood those tools were extensions of capability rather than replacements for skill. Vasquez, now running her own training facility and consulting for multiple military organizations, reflected on how one challenge from an arrogant war master had cascaded into a fundamental shift in how the Confederacy approached combat. "I snapped his wrist before he could swing," she said during a lecture to instructor candidates. That was the technique. But the real lesson wasn't about joint locks or leverage. It was about assumptions. The Confederacy assumed that weapons made unarmed combat obsolete. They assumed natural advantages guaranteed victory. They assumed that humans, lacking impressive biology, would be inferior in combat. Every assumption was wrong. And the beautiful irony is that we've been trying to tell them this for years, but they didn't believe it until someone demonstrated it in a way they couldn't ignore. Will the Confederacy eventually catch up to human martial arts development? An instructor candidate asked. Maybe in a few thousand years, if they're dedicated. But here's the thing, we're not standing still. While they're learning the basics we developed 3,000 years ago, we're innovating with new systems, integrating technology with traditional techniques, exploring applications in zero gravity, developing methods for our new augmented combat frames. By the time they reach our current level, we'll have evolved again. Not because we're superior, because we've never stopped treating this knowledge as vital. Never assumed we'd learned everything, never concluded that weapons made skill obsolete. We kept learning because we understood a truth that the rest of the galaxy forgot. The most reliable weapon you have is knowledge, and the only time you don't have it is when you stop developing it. The lecture ended, the students dispersed to practice, and somewhere across the galaxy, a Kralix warrior successfully submitted a Vorthani opponent using a technique that a human had taught a Morellian, who had adapted it for the Screeth, who had shared it with the Kralix. The knowledge was spreading, mutating, improving, becoming something more than what any single species had developed alone. And on a neutral station, in an arena where it had all started, there was a plaque commemorating the match. It read, "Here, Captain Reina Vasquez demonstrated that evolution provides tools, but training provides skill. Natural advantages create potential. Knowledge creates capability. The universe doesn't care about your biology. Physics is the only judge, and technique is the only lawyer that can argue your case." Beneath the plaque, in smaller text, someone had added, "Also, don't telegraph your strikes. Seriously, it's embarrassing." Drakor had insisted on that addition. Vasquez had approved it. The Confederacy, it turned out, had spent 17,000 cycles developing ways to fight at a distance. Then humans showed up and reminded everyone that sometimes the most effective combat happens within arm's reach. And when it does, knowing 47 ways to break someone's wrist without throwing a punch is significantly more useful than having claws you never learned to use properly. The irony was delicious. The education was ongoing. And somewhere, In countless dojos across countless worlds, beings of every species were learning the truth that humans had understood for millennia. The most sophisticated approach to combat isn't having the biggest weapons. It's knowing so many ways to win that weapons become optional rather than essential. Civilized warfare, it turned out, meant being so competent at fighting that you rarely needed to. Human had figured that out approximately 10,000 years before the rest of the galaxy caught on.